Okay, welcome everyone to DLD Conversation. DLD is Development Leadership Dialogue on Institute of College of Development Economics and Finance. We were founded in September 2023. We try to bring people from, if you like, different sectors of the development community, the public sector, the private sector, the civil society, academia, internship organizations. And we do this by organizing workshops and dialogues and debates and so on. So this is one of our kind of continuing things, the conversations. So we bring two, maybe sometimes three speakers to talk about the particular issue. We don't call it seminars because it's not, the format is not a traditional seminar where someone comes, talks for 55 minutes on a paper and then people raise hand and ask questions. So the format today will be, I'll introduce the speakers in a minute, but the lead speaker, Faiza Shaheen, will talk for 25 minutes. And then our commentator, Max Lawson, will talk for 20 minutes. And then maybe I'll chip in for a couple of minutes. And then we'll open the floor so that we can have a conversation. Yeah? So that's the idea. So today's, I should get this right. Conversation is on is growing inequality a problem for international development? What is driving it, and what can be done about it? Yep. So inequality is a problem for people who are concerned with development, partly because it is a reflection of the nature of the global capitalist economic system, in which countries have huge income disparities. But the important thing is that a lot of this disparity has been created by this historical process where some countries exploited the others through slavery, colonialism, unequal treaties, other imperialist practices. It's also a problem in the sense that the development problem in the sense that at the national level, inequality does certain things to your development trajectory. I mean, it's a complex picture. I wouldn't say that it's always like this, always like that. But without understanding the inequality problem, we cannot really design a better alternative development path. And who better is it that can talk about this with a truly global perspective? We have our main speaker, Faiza Shaheen, who is a distinguished institutional fellow.
Policy
fellow at the Institute for Inequalities at LSE. But that's only, I think, the kind of a footnote in your amazing career. She's an economist, politician, thinker, activist. Very difficult to describe her. She's commented upon and organized international actions on many issues related to development, but especially the issues related to inequality and class and so on. So she is here to give us her kind of perspective on these things. And as the commentator, we have our amazing Max Lawson, who is the head of inequality policy at Oxfam. These are the people who produce all this inequality report saying the richest 527 guys added 7.2 trillion to their wealth this year. I mean, he's been one of the leading voices talking about international inequality and kind of organize many campaigns that bring this to these people's attention, and then helping people organize actions to fight it. So we have an amazing pair here, and yeah, the room's full. And lots of people are watching online, no? Oh,
We're filming as well.
oh yeah, the online is later, yeah. Okay, so excellent. Let me invite Faiza to give us her perspective. Let's give her a warm round of applause.
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And many years ago, gosh, when I was doing my PhD, like giving away my age, like 20 years ago, I did a summer school with Joseph Stiglitz, and he'd got all his friends to come and do talks. And I'm sure I've told you this before, Ha-Joon. Ha-Joon came, and all of us PhD students were like, I mean, there were so many incredible speakers that had come that week, but we were all just like fell in love with Ha-Joon. And it's genuinely amazing to hear him read out such a nice thing about me, from your heroes. It means a lot. So thank you for that. And just to say, as someone that's been obsessed with inequality for a long while, from childhood, but especially when I went from East London to Oxford and saw just how rich the rich were, and just what they would say about working class people when they got drunk, genuinely, and how they would treat some of my East London friends that would come up, especially if they had strong East London accents. I just kind of got obsessed with this issue of inequality, and back then no one cared. I remember when I started my PhD, the senior economist was like, Faiza, I was also working at a think tank, and he was like, why do you keep going on about inequality? Like, you're not going to get anywhere. If you want to do well as an economist, focus on economic growth. If you want to be a nice person, roll eyes, do something on poverty. Genuinely. And so, and I felt really annoyed because I felt like I had seen these both sides, and there was something in it. It wasn't right, not just in terms of fairness, not just in terms I felt like it was an injustice, but I could see, one, that lots of smart people I grew up with were smarter than the people I was at Oxford with, and they weren't getting the same opportunities, but also that there were going to be repercussions to that extreme inequality that I could see even in the early noughties. I want to start by saying that things have shifted. We've come a long way in terms of how much we pay attention to inequality, and through the work of talks of people like Ha-Joon Chang, but also the work of Oxfam and others. I'm saying that now because I think I can do these presentations and people can feel quite depressed. And so I'm trying to say, on the lighter side, we are, genuinely, it was like in the backwaters of economics, like no one cared about inequality. And so in that way, we've come a long way. I think I'm going to reflect upon a bit about I've obviously been involved in politics as well, but some international work that I've done that's really made me understand inequality much more as a political problem now, and where we are in terms of the repercussions of income and wealth inequality, and wealth in particular. So let me just start by saying where much of the thinking I'm going to talk about today comes from. So I was lucky enough to be at NYU for a couple of years leading a global study. And that study used, what we did was build relationships with UN ambassadors from different countries, and we'd bring those countries in to look at their policies on inequality. So a lot of these countries had centre or centre-left governments that said, actually, we do want to address inequality, and we're willing to come together and share ideas, showcase things that we're doing right, learn from things that we're doing wrong, and work together on particular issues where we could potentially move a global conversation or a particular issue globally. So at any one time, we would have 10 to 12 governments working with us, and it was wide-ranging. So from high-income countries like Canada, and middle-income countries like Indonesia, and low-income countries like Sierra Leone. And one of the things that really struck me about doing that work was that I was like, wow, this is a really disparate number of countries. It's going to be completely different issues. And one of the key things I want you to take away from what I speak about today is actually how often we heard this similar things again and again. We heard similar things in terms of people we spoke to and the way that inequality was being felt, how people felt the injustice of inequality, but also felt that their leaders were corrupt, that they felt that their leaders weren't listening to them, We kept hearing again and again about the same issues that people cared about and felt that weren't being dealt with. Yes, typical public services like health, but housing. We did this survey across 8 or 9 countries, and the number one issue that people spoke about and they felt that governments weren't dealing with was housing and access to affordable housing. So there was really quite a vast similarity. I kept hearing the same thing again and again in a different language. And also some of the problems that division was the big thing, like how divisive narratives were being used to stop action on inequality. So I'm going to reflect on some of that research that we did there, which was a combination of kind of elite interviews, polling on the ground, focus groups, and just kind of general observation. And that work is ongoing, but the first stage of that work was launched by 7 heads of state, including, you'll see here, the president of Sierra Leone, still the president of Sierra Leone, Prime Minister of Spain, Sanchez, you see Jacinda Ardern at the time, at the time, the Costa Rican president as well. So it's, we were lucky to have this connection into high-level government, but we did make an effort to go and speak to civil society, trade unions, etc. So this is just to give you a sense of the country involvement, and Republic of Korea was involved, but then they fell out because the government changed, and you know all about that. They're still paying the cost of that. And I do want to say, I didn't do it on this one because I know I'm going to end up speaking for 20 minutes, but the amount of countries we lost, and the major reason we lost them was because some right-wing politician had found a way to divide the population. So in South Korea, it was about gender. In Sweden, it was about immigration. It was continuously something that would come up. We were really scared we were going to lose Spain, but Sanchez fought back, and it's an interesting story. And so at Costa Rica, we lost because of gay rights, LGBT rights. The right had managed to spin a story about that. Even in Costa Rica, which is, always coming up very high on the happiness index. And so it was, for me, when I talk about the politics of this, that it was just clear to me that this has become more, that the reason why we're not seeing the change that we should see, the change that people want to see. So when you look at how public polls on this, they say they want more action on inequality, and yet we see less action on inequality. It's a big political problem and political barriers. So just quickly on what inequality, and talking about kind of inequality in the developing world or in low and middle income countries. This is all from the World Income Database, which of course many of you will know is a brilliant resource. This is top 10% national income share. And you'll see there in red, darker reds, where the share of the total is more than 50%. And many global south countries, certainly over sort of 43% there, but generally a problem around the world. And I want to talk more about wealth, and I think this conversation has shifted to talk more about wealth, partly through the work of Piketty and others, but also because wealth inequality is much worse, and it has bigger consequences in terms of the economy, how the economy is working, and also the political system. So this is top net 1% net personal wealth share. And you can see, in parts of the world, 32% plus, just the top 1% wealth share. That's very significant. And, you can see that, in countries like South Africa, it's even higher. So at the top end of that range. This is a huge problem, and I did look at the data to look at if things are getting better or worse. When we did our work looking at back in 2022, 2021, we found that a third of countries had seen a reduction in their income Gini, and so you might say that's a positive story. There are some countries that also seen a little bit of reduction in wealth inequality, but it's from a very, very high level, so it's hard to say that things are getting much better. And certainly this is a very stubborn problem. I'm sure Max is going to talk about this too. And of course the inverse of that, well, not quite the inverse, but the bottom 50% of net, look at this, how much of this is yellow in terms of the share of the total. It's over the bright red spots, right? And it's important to remember that it's the inverse. The rich are sucking up a large share of the wealth, and that's leaving very little for the bottom 50%. I mean, if you take the bottom 10%, most of those people are in debt, right? So even more than that. So this is the kind of level of inequality that we're talking about. I'm not going to go on too long about what's driving this, because again, I'm short on time, but this is the kind of typical list that's spoken about, and Ha-Joon has already spoken about why this is important, and his books and work on market liberalization, globalization, of course, is really well known, and also the remnants of colonialism in terms of concentration of land, commodity ownership. Informal employment is quite important if you're going to look at income inequality in particular. Issues of financial exclusion and access to financing, poor or non-existent public services. The bit that I'm going to talk about now, and I'm happy to pick up on the rest of it, is just weak institutions and corruption and rent seeking. And again, we saw this in many ways in different parts of the world. Because it's not just now low and middle income countries that have got weak institutions, we see that in rich countries too. And it's really, I guess, most recently most popularized by looking at, I was going to put a picture of Elon Musk, but I thought I would spare you that. But, you know, of course, it's not just the US that has seen a major increase in the number of billionaires, or where they're concentrated. This gives you a sense that, of course, there are more growing in low and middle income countries as well. And again, they have significant impact in terms of lobbying, influence on politics. And I always tell people this in the UK, when I was running as a Labour candidate, when I first got selected, within days, I got emails from Bupa Healthcare, from like a private train company, and then Barclays Bank, which had all sent me information saying, we'd love to have a meeting with you, and here's some free information on your constituency. And they're like, you know, starting that now. And because I was still doing this work when I was reselected, I spoke to some like people and some friends in Indonesia, some colleagues in Indonesia about it, and they were saying that they had found similar things that had happened to them in terms of once they had been put in place, the emails that you get, not the same companies, but yes, companies emailing you very quickly, ingratiating themselves to you. And so this is a very common thing. That's just at a small scale. We know that, you know, political donations, etc., happen at a much larger scale. So what did these countries tell us in terms of key challenges? And of course, it was kind of different emphasis with different countries, especially on financing and debt issues. So these four areas became really important in our conversations and kept coming up. So first is, of course, we are in an era of polycrisis. When we were doing this work, Russia invaded Ukraine, which, of course, caused a massive increase in various different commodity prices, energy prices that had reverberations all around the world. We had a few partners in the Arab region who had heavily reliant on wheat from that part of the world, from Ukraine, and had seen their cost of living crisis really kick off. But it wasn't just that, it was the interlocking crisis of that and climate crisis alongside political crisis alongside. And so this era of polycrisis things, what we say is, crises that are making each other worse and interlocking in a way that makes it very hard to deal with. And so we did quite a lot of work looking at the different parts of the world that were facing polycrisis. The next big thing, and this is still the case because nothing's been resolved, even though this has been an ongoing conversation on financing and debt issues, what we found is a number of countries, that the same countries that were in the worst case in terms of polycrisis, in terms of a cost of living crisis, and were also the ones already most in debt. So they were in a fiscal straitjacket, they couldn't move, and yet they had the worst problems. And one of those countries was Pakistan, which is the country that my mum was from and that I have a lot of connection to. And so just, talking to my cousin just yesterday about how much everything's gone up by and continually going up by, and how difficult life has become, even for someone, lower middle class, is really striking. We did lose countries like where there were more progressive governments because of IMF behaviour, right? You'd think that they've learned something, but they haven't. And it was really interesting, for instance, to work with Tunisia, that had, post-revolution been seen as one of the countries that had been most stable, and yet the IMF had put so much pressure on them to make repaying their debt, restructuring their debt a priority, rather than, delivering material change to the population, which was what was required after that revolution. And they got stuck. They kept having a change of government, and it made the country extremely unstable. The third one is state capture, so lack of transparency about government contracts, wherever in door. We hear this, of course, here as well, corporate lobbying, a clear resistance of tackling wealth at the top of society. And so even from quite lefty governments, we would hear, we're really struggling with doing something on wealth taxes, for instance. It's just too difficult, there's too much of a block, there's too much pressure on us not to do this, and it's also playing out really badly in terms of how the media then is picking us up. So, there was even amongst quite lefty leaders the sense of like, we feel nervous about others. The Colombians, Sanchez Spain did step forward and do something, and I think there's something positive to be learned from that. And then finally, this point about growing division. Visible increases in the language of division and increased polarization. So this is 28 countries surveyed. This is a bigger survey from Edelman. But in our countries as well, we were struck, even like I was saying, Costa Rica, but Uruguay was involved, like Canada, all saying that our country is becoming increasingly divided. And it's a political trick, of course, when there are less resources, or you want to give people less resources. I'm being too slow. Have a look at Edelman Trust Barometer, which I think is really helpful in capturing how inequality is resulting in a loss of trust in government. So this is income-based inequality creates two trust realities. So basically this looks at asks people how they feel about trust in government, trust in media, trust in business. And it showed that the rich in many countries felt more trust because they're getting their own way still, whereas the poor feel massively distrustful. And this is a couple of years ago. There's a recent update as well. I don't know if I'm putting that. It's here, which is that there's been a change of lots of countries have had elections, and it's actually failed to improve trust. So people are just like, what's the point? Anyone that's knocked on doors and done political work, people will say to you all the time, the level of despondency in so many countries of people just saying, well, what's the point of voting? They're all the same, or they're not listening to me anyway. So this is how much, actually, so you see the UK's at the bottom there, distrust increased after the election. So I'm running out of time, but just on this, I think the thing that really struck me about this point about inequality and division is that even countries like South Africa are on here, as they feel like their country is more divided today than it was in the past. This is an apartheid country. That just tells us how much inequality is resulting in this sense of distrust with each other, with the authorities, and this sense of like our communities are not getting on. So what do we do? And the work that we were doing in New York was much more focused on policy solutions, which was good for my mental health. But, it's really tough. The thing that we did find when we looked at the data, when we had the conversations, that there was three things that governments needed to take seriously if they were both going to get inequality to reduce, but also stay in power, because that was, as a political strategy as well, to do these things. So 3 things. One was creating highly visible material change in people's lives. So that could be obviously about housing, having more money in their pockets. So social protection, all those things are really important. COVID-19 exposed a lot of those areas, and also highlighted unattended areas. So digital connectivity, care economy, those are the sorts of things that people were looking at, that would make them trust governments more. Secondly was what we called securing credibility. So things that help the state function fairly, function more transparently. And the thing that we found as well, this was true of all of these, unless you did all 3 of these things, you would end up falling back. So for instance, if you failed to think about how you people have more trust in you. You could be doing some great things on bringing people together, but you would still end up losing the next election or falling in terms of popularity. And this third one was solidarity building, which was this point about addressing divisions, not ignoring it, which I think a lot of governments do, not playing into it if you're a centre-left thing, which again is another thing that governments seem to do, but actually policies that tackle prejudice and building a sense of justice across race and class lines or whatever it may be, gender, for instance, taking it on, having social dialogues, thinking about things like police reform. And so, these three kind of buckets of policy areas you had to do simultaneously, and you had to be really loud about. You couldn't just do it quietly and expect people to notice that don't necessarily always notice. And you couldn't wait for the last minute either. I mean, people talk a lot about wealth taxes, so I just wanted to say something super quick. We did this website that brought together a lot of the solutions we were finding called inequalitysolutions.com. So have a look. It's from solutions that have been tried at different levels in different parts of the world, addressing different parts of the inequality problem. And we looked at wealth taxes and taxes in general. And I think one of the things that we were really struck by, so this was like a solidarity fund or a solidarity tax that Uruguay put in place during COVID. And we found lots of examples of solidarity taxes, which essentially are like a wealth tax or an income tax that you introduce at a time when you're like, we're in crisis, we have this big issue we need to deal with. It can be the climate crisis. It was COVID in this instance. It was, Germany did it when they had German reunification. I think it was Kenya that did it when they were having a big problem with HIV. They introduced a particular tax on the richest in society and had a very strong story about how that money was going to be used. And we found lots of success in terms of implementing that tax and popularity of that tax amongst people. So have a look at some of that research online. And then just final, just as important as all of this was the narrative and how we tell the story. We did focus groups in Canada, Sierra Leone, Costa Rica, and Tunisia, and we put this statement, and everyone agreed with it. It was like I said, I kept hearing the same thing, but in different languages. So you need to have a good story to go with these things, and this is something that we just tried that seemed, that stuck in people's heads. No matter where we come from or what our cultural background, most of us work hard for our families, but today in whatever country, there are some powerful people, certain politicians, they're lobbyists, and a small number of extremely wealthy individuals. They use their power to benefit themselves. We need policies that redistribute wealth. We need more equality. We need to address corruption at the top of society. And it was just amazing how many people would say, yeah, that's exactly. I mean, it's the same statement we used in those countries. Final reflections. The consequences of inequality in high and middle-income, low-income countries overlap. I think a minority of low and middle-income countries are seeing a reduction, but from a high starting point. Change is blocked in multiple ways, but I think sort of elite interests are a really big part of the story. Wealth taxes are needed and are working in some places, and I think the recent vote in France as well is interesting, but they face political barriers. I think this is a question, I guess, to Max. I've known Max for a long time. We've been working on inequality in one way or another for some years. Is that when I went to the World Bank meetings a couple of years ago, compared to when I went in 2015, it was notable how little inequality was spoken about compared to 2015. It was kind of its vogue era even, and I wonder if it's fallen off the agenda a bit. And there's a need for global and national action, but we can talk about that.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Max.
How long have I got?
20 minutes?
Okay, I'll be as quick as I can.
No.
Take the slides off so that it's not distracting.
You don't have PowerPoint, do you?
No.
Good.
I knew that would be hard to follow. So, hi, I'm Max. I work for Oxfam, and I am, as Ha-Joon said, I'm the one who helps produce those numbers you sometimes see on the TV about one billionaire owning the same as half the planet. So yeah, that's what I do. So I just wanted to ask, is there anyone in the room who doesn't think Elon Musk is the most evil billionaire? Has anyone got another billionaire that they dislike more?
Don't you think there's some that we don't know about? No, probably the most.
Has anyone got like a hidden billionaire, or is just?
Hang on, is it that the most evil billionaire or most evil person?
Well, I think I'll be just sticking with billionaires for the minute. No, everyone just really dislikes... Anyone like Elon Musk in the room? I mean, one of the great things, the campaigner in me, one of the great things about working on inequality is the quality of the villains. It just gets better every year. I mean, it's just amazing. So just when you think you've got the best villain in the world. So I wrote a blog a couple of years ago about the world's most famous moment of inequality. And I think for many people, the most famous moment was when Marie Antoinette, during the French Revolution, she was told that the poorest people of Paris were starving because they didn't have bread. And she said, well, can't they eat cake instead? And that's probably the peak inequality moment in history. Okay, so let me give you another possibility. And I put it in the context of, like, imagine you're at Netflix and you're trying to pitch a drama, okay? So you've got a worldwide pandemic. 23 million people have died. You're got this billionaire. He's wearing a cowboy hat. He's just been to space in his own rocket, okay? The rocket is shaped just like a phallus. I mean, from a kind of psychology point of view, you can read a lot into what he's done. He's just thrust into space with his friends, and he's returned to Earth, and he's giving a press conference in the middle of a pandemic where people, essential workers, including many of his workers, are risking their lives every day, and he thanks them for paying for his space flight. So I personally think at that moment Jeff Bezos was the most evil man on Earth, and he also looks a bit like Dr. Evil. I don't know if you've seen I mean, if you ever see the two put next to each other. But Elon Musk has really taken a leap into the front seat. And I think, joking aside, the point is that, I mean, if someone's got a bigger house than you, or they've got a nicer car, or a yacht or something, that's probably bad. But when they bought a judge, when they bought an election, when they bought an entire newspaper, when they bought what we get our news from, that's when you start to see their wealth begin to corrode and undermine and destroy everything that we hold dear. And I think that's the thing that Elon Musk is teaching the world every single day that we watch it. And I would say, again, to be really positive, the thing that got me into this more than anything was a book called The Spirit Level that was written just over 10 years ago. And it's very positive. It talks about the incredible benefits of a more equal society. So it's not talking about all the harms of an unequal society, it's talking about all the lovely things, and they are genuinely lovely, that come with a much more equal society. And I've been fortunate with Oxfam to live and work in over 20 countries around the world, and most recently living in Kenya with my family, and then coming back here and seeing the juxtaposition between a country, and this country is far from perfect and is getting more unequal by the day, but it is much, much more equal than Kenya. And to give you an example, so we lived in a gated community of about 12 or 15 houses. We were the only white family, the rest were very rich Kenyans. There was a security guard who worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day at the top of the road. And we had a debate on the street WhatsApp group because they wanted to cut down the bushes at the top of the road. And he said he didn't have anywhere to go to the toilet. And I said, well, surely he could go to the toilet in one of your houses at the top of the street, or maybe in your servants' quarters. And they didn't want him going near their toilet. You know, it's like medieval France, the way that they see the poorest people. And I think this is very common all over the world. Hideous attitudes towards ordinary people from the very richest. But there's almost the impact of an incredibly segregated life. So you live in this gated community. Your children, my children, went to a private school. You have private healthcare. You know, you go to a private shopping mall where there are security guards on the gate that only let in people who look like they've got enough money to spend. And you don't realise that, because this is just the air you breathe in Kenya. You're breathing an unequal air, but it separates you from everybody else all the time. And then I came back here in the midst of COVID, and I remember just going to the public park. There are no public parks in Nairobi. There's one in the middle of town. Everything else is private land. So London is full, thank God, still of public parks. And it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, you can go and walk your dog there.
Musk is not listening to this.
I'm sure he's probably thinking about privatising them now. So simple things like that. Schools, my sons now go to a government school, and they have, the class looks very similar. You know, they're still the only white kids in the class, but the difference is most of his class are working class. And my son is getting to live, play, hang out with people who are a lot poorer than him. And that's his lived experience, and they get to know each other, and it's incredibly positive. So I would say the value of equality in more equal societies, and as a campaigner, the glue that brings so many issues together. If you work on tax, or you're campaigning for healthcare, or you want really, progressive industrial policy, or there are so many aspects of a better society, and one glue is that if you do all those things and all of the amazing policy solutions that Faiza and team were looking at, you can rapidly reduce inequality. And that was the second message I wanted to get across, which is that another positive thing about this is inequality is in no way, shape or form inevitable. This is, and they would very much like us all to believe that. And I read an amazing book last year called The Dawn of Everything. And if anyone's read that, by David Graeber, it was the last, and David Wengrow, it's the last book David Graeber wrote just before he died. And they go back in ancient human history, and there are found cities from thousands of years ago where you had tens of thousands of people living there, and every house was the same size. So there was absolutely no evidence of palaces or big. The idea that as soon as we get into big cities, we have to have hierarchy and we have to have bosses, and is a myth. You have all kinds of different societies in ancient human history, and of course much, much more recently. Sweden was the most unequal country in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. Rich people had 2 votes. They went from that to having a Gini coefficient, one of the lowest in the world, in the space of 30 or 40 years. So I would say another positive thing is this is not inevitable. It's a solution it's a problem that we have lots of solutions for, very effective ones. And I think it's something that we can see a big change in. Does that mean that we're not up against some incredibly difficult politics at the moment, and the politics of division and setting people against each other? I often think of the idea that if you've got a world that's extremely unequal, then you have a choice. Either you make it more equal, particularly in democratic societies, or you practice the politics of distraction and division, because that's your 2 options. Either you reduce inequality, or you distract and divide, because you can't have a healthy democracy with a genuine rational debate and the levels of inequality that we have at the moment. So something has to give, and at the moment it's giving in the wrong direction, the direction of division and hate, but it doesn't have to go in that direction. And as I said, working on this similar things to Faiza, you see good examples from all over the world of countries that are really trying to make their country more equal. And we have seen some progress at global level, at the G20, coming together to talk about, for the first time ever, the need to tax rich people fairly. The other thing is to remember that many of these things have got a lot worse. So, the average tax rate paid by one of these billionaires is now 2 or 3%. That was never the case. I always like to say which rich country had the highest rate of income tax in the world historically. Does anyone know?
Scandinavia?
No.
No, it was the US. They had a top rate of tax of 93% up until 1970. And then at the end of the 1970s and 1980s, it was still around 70%, the top rate of income tax. So it's perfectly possible to have decent taxes on rich people and have a vibrant capitalist economy. You don't have to become Soviet Russia to have a system that's much, much fairer, much more equal. I just wanted to give you that sense. It is possible, it can be done, but it's going to be a fight to make it happen. Thanks.
Okay, let me just make a few, really footnotes just to liven things up. a bit. Sweden introduced income tax first in 1932. Even the US introduced it in 1913, and Britain introduced it in 1842. So it was one of the most conservative, right-wing, unequal countries in the world. And by the 1970s, people were talking about the third way, yeah? Sweden being between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, later, Tony Blair talked about the third way, which was between Sweden and the United States, not between the Soviet Union and the United States. So that gives you a bit of historical perspective. But I'm really glad that you brought up the U.S. income tax rate. Yeah? And very few people know this. Yeah? And even Ronald Reagan brought it down to only 40. I mean, today is, even officially, what is it, like 32% or something, the top rate?
And in reality, much.
Yeah, in reality, you have the lower rate for capital gains tax and all kinds of exemptions. So the effective rate that you are paying is, like what Max said. Your example about Kenya reminded me of couple of stories I came across in Latin America. When I went to this university called Campinas in Brazil near São Paulo. Campinas is like sort of Cambridge of Brazil. This University of Campinas is like MIT, except that they have a heterodox economics department. So that's why I was invited. And after my seminar, they took me to this shopping mall for nice sushi. Brazil, having 2 million ethnic Japanese, have a wonderful sushi culture, at least in São Paulo. And one of them casually commented, "Oh, this is a very socially progressive shopping mall." I said, "What the hell are you talking about? Yeah? How can shopping mall be socially progressive?" He said, "No. This shopping mall, unlike most other upmarket shopping malls in Brazil, less public buses to come in. I mean, basically other shopping malls refuse to let public buses come near you so that the poor people cannot come to the shopping mall. Yeah? So even before the security guards, you are the block access to this space. Yeah? And then another incredible story was a few years ago when I went to Colombia. This guy who invited me, he was a rich person. He was but socially conscientious. So he was showing me around this very upmarket neighborhood, and he said, "Look at that park. It was quite a run-down space. That park used to be Japanese park. Apparently, the Japanese government donated it like decades ago, but it began to be run down, and kind of like 10 years ago, the Colombian government offered to kind of renovate the park because it was getting embarrassing. And apparently these rich people didn't want the park to be renovated because they didn't want the poor people to come to the park. Yeah? So they would rather live with a dilapidated park than have seeing poor people there. Yeah? So this is the kind of thing we are talking about. But I tell this anecdote to say that I think it's not just about income and wealth, it's about the space, access to space. Yeah? So that what Max said about the public parks here is a very, very important point. Yeah? In most countries, poor people just don't have access to any nice space. Yeah? No green space. I mean, the libraries, free museums, £5 tickets for musical theaters. Yeah? You may think this is nothing, but it's so important. And that's what makes this society still a bit more decent than many others. Yeah? Because in the US, in many, almost all the developing countries, poor people just don't have anywhere to go, other than their dilapidated neighborhood. Yeah? So giving access to spaces, yeah, to cultural things, spaces especially. Okay, I mean, I'm not naive, that giving the access doesn't mean that these people will have the time or the money to actually use it fully, but, still that you go to public libraries, at least the poor people can come and, at least in this country, use the internet, yeah, because they don't have internet at home, yeah. They can charge their phones, yeah, they can read books, yeah. So I think that we need to emphasize the role of space in inequality, especially cultural space. Okay, so let me open the floor to questions, comments. Yes, back there.
My name is Antonius, a student from UCL. So thank you for the great talks. My question is about the connection between the political and also economy. So there is a quote that when government do the right things, they will lose the next election. So is there any limitation of the progress, like how much progress is too fast? I mean, is there any limitation that, okay, so the progress from progressive side, we should set the speed of the progress so we can make a stable progress, not like when you do the right thing and then the next election the right way will win. Thank you.
So shall we? How do you want to play it? Shall we collect a few questions and then you you guys respond? Yes, gentleman there.
Mark, I'm a visiting professor at King's College. No one's talked about sustainable development goals. There's a whole piece there on inequality, and I just wonder what importance you attach to the SDGs as being a mechanism to move forward the debate on inequality.
Good.
A little teaser, if you could add something to those targets, what might you add? I was really interested in your points about access to space, for example, which doesn't appear. Are there other things that we should include?
Yeah. Okay, so one more and then, yeah.
Hi. Gini and Waju on the Council of Rural Administration. My question is related to history. So, the UK in 1900, 1% of population control, twice the world. What actually changed to get us here?
Okay, so let's do a few more rounds of questions and comments. So first, Faiza, if you also want to respond to anything that
just to say on public space, I agree. I mean, one thing I noticed in Pakistan is that some of the nice mosques have quite nice areas around them, and that means everyone goes. And I think it's important, not just for, like you say, access to space going somewhere, but also in terms of mixing. I think one reason they're able to divide us is because dehumanization, right? So if we're mixing, if we see each other as people across race and class, religious lines, if we have moments to have empathy for each other, to smile at each other's kids, then that actually is really powerful in terms of fighting the division. So I think, it's important on multiple levels, and it's why in countries like the UK where we have public space, we have to make sure that we fight for it and that we keep it as it is, because believe me, there's lots of public spaces being sold off. The NHS is increasingly using private services, and they're doing that in a way to schools now, academies, all that land has been sold off to given to companies now. So just because we have it here doesn't mean we'll always have it. So it is really, really important on multiple levels. How much progress is too fast? I think Spain is a really interesting case. So we were working with the Spanish government, and we were pretty sure, I think they thought as well, that they were going to lose to the right, but also the far right Vox was doing really, really well. Basically Sanchez called this election last minute and wrong-footed his opponents a bit just from the start. But also they had a lot to talk about in terms of what they'd done on increasing benefits, what they'd done on housing, what they were doing to address various different kind of material conditions. And they did really focus what they were talking about on that. And so I think, and actually they had done quite a few things quite quickly. And it just goes to show that you can, as long as you have a good story to tell and you point out to people that their lives have got better. So Spain did like some really smart things when the cost of living crisis kicked in. Like they cut VAT on food, so it immediately meant that inflation didn't go up as much, right? So they had this really positive story to tell, especially when compared to neighbours. And then they had a very clear story to tell on the far right. You know, a point about either tomorrow you're going to wake up in 2023, I can't remember the election, 2023, or you're going to wake up in 1950, right? Like, and they had this story to tell about what it would mean with the far right, and so and to fight that. And so yeah, I think you can take people with you quite quickly, but you do have to make the effort for them to feel like they're going with you. So yeah, I think we can do it quickly, and we have to do it quickly. Absolutely on SDGs, I was going to write about it, and Max and I have actually worked together on some aspects of SDGs over the years, but. The inequality for Sustainable Development Goal 10, when they looked at progress, it was like one of the worst performing, which is no surprise. The measures of inequality are really poor on there. We were arguing for a Palmer measurement, which is basically like a much easier way to understand. So my brain's going there, 10% to then 40%, 40, bottom 40% to 10%. And so, yeah, there's some ways in which we need to change the measurements on that goal to make it more effective. Of course, there's going to be an argument all over again about what those SDG goals are replaced with, and it's really important that we make the argument on inequality. Max and I were also both involved in a conversation with the World Bank on their measures of progress and asking them to put a Palmer index. And then they put in an extreme inequality Gini, what was it they went for in the end? 0.35, was it, or 0.4?
0.4.
0.4, and we were arguing for something else. Anyway, it could have been much worse, but yeah, there's definitely more that needs to be done, because you can say the top line, but if you don't have the measures underneath it, then it's easy to get away with it. On the UK, oh my God, I can't read my handwriting. What did you say? What was the question on the UK?
What changed?
Oh, what
to
changed?
Go from being going to be unequal to...
Yeah, I mean, multiple things, but I mean, one of the key parts of that story are the deunionisation. So you see this plummeting in the number of people in trade unions. And of course, to counter elite interests, you need broad-based collective action, and that so many more people were unionised before, countered that elite power. And so that's a big part of the story. There's other things as well, like financialisation. But yeah, if you take those two things, there's a really good OECD study from a few years ago. I think it was called Divided We Stand. And they did a kind of regression analysis where they looked at the varying factors, and those two were the top.
Okay, let's take another round. Chris,
sorry.
you had...
No, you said everything.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Chris, Josie, and then, let's take one from this side. I don't know who raised the hand first, but...
So shall I head off? Okay.
Yeah.
So, thank you both. I wanted to sort of draw a line between the two of you. And Max, you talked about inequality not being inevitable, and I agree with that. Although, anywhere where pretty high levels of inequality have been dramatically decreased, it's only really happened, maybe, possibly, I'm just putting this to you, as a result of fairly unpleasant and horrible upheaval. So when you say likely it's going to be a fight, often it really has been a fight. And I think that brings me to a question about how you think realistically, and I think Faiza, you began to talk about this realistically on this, how realistically one can tackle harmful forms of inequality without major disruptive upheaval.
Okay.
And Faiza, just kind of follow through on that. You emphasised a lot of common themes, and that's really interesting, but I wanted you to talk more about variation. For example, you mentioned Gabrielle Palmer right at the end of it. And Gabrielle talks about these homogeneous middles and the variation, the heterogeneous tails. I think it's terribly important. You can have richest decile of the population, with a very high share of national income. And yet in some parts of the world, they invest a much larger share of that than they do, say, in South Africa, Namibia, or in Latin America or something. So, you know, it's about understanding those variations in realistic strategic terms.
Okay, so it's
Yeah, thank you so much for really engaging presentations. And I was very struck by the income and wealth inequalities you showed in your statistics. But I was also wondering what this kind of aggregation could be hiding. If you think of the intersections of axes of inequalities, I'm particularly interested in gender inequalities, racialized groups and how they experience migrants and so on. And I wondered how we could tell this story so as to keep them in view. The second point I wanted to make is that you mentioned a number of policy choices that could improve inequalities, and I thought that they were useful. But I was thinking that perhaps not all policy choices are equal. Both of you mentioned wealth taxes, but what else could we do, given the point Ha-Joon, for example, made about inequalities in states? There are inequalities in labor relations, there are lessons of land reforms and so on. How feasible are these policies, and which of these could actually be much more fundamental in equalizing society?
Okay, you don't in black.
Yes, thank you for the great presentation. Dr. Hani, a PhD student in development studies at SOAS. And my question is about how the definition of the inequality has evolved and how it will be. This question is actually related to the previous questions. And we are talking about only income disparity, or how we can kind of incorporate new conceptualizations of inequality, as Professor Chang mentioned. And like, how can we measure different types of inequalities, and how can we come up with a data set with certain types of inequalities? Thank you.
Okay, maybe Max can go first in this one.
Yeah, okay. There's a certain school of thought that says you only reduce inequality if you have a really terrible war and it's a really horrible moment and wealth is destroyed and the people get incredibly angry with their rulers and they demand a more equal world. And I think that's very much what happened after World War II in Europe. There was a sense in which people, it wasn't so much about the war, but it was about not wanting to go back to the Great Depression and the unemployment of the 1930s. But I think I'm not of the view that you when I said it's a fight, I would say the first thing is that, in my view, and it's just my personal view, the best way to learn about change is to look at the right and how they're changing our world. The left has been failing to do it successfully for 20 or 30 years. So I think in answer to your question, they don't do incremental reform. As soon as they get into power, they do as much as they can, as fast as they can. And they want to fight. They're getting more and more violent, more and more aggressive, they're setting the terms. You know, it's not, we don't get to decide whether we're going to have peaceful, incremental change or whether there's going to be a fight in the next 20 or 30 years. Everything is being decided by the other side. So we have to be prepared for both, I think, absolutely prepared for both. And I have a cousin who lives in Sussex, he's working class, he's very much a Labour voter, but he likes to shoot things. And he's got, on his Facebook, he goes to Sweden, of all places, every summer, and he shoots deer, and he puts up pictures of deer on his Facebook. And he's a fireman in real life, and a trade unionist, and he just likes shooting things. And every year I put a comment on Facebook like, can't you have a more peaceful hobby? And this year I said to him, do you know what? I think your skills are going to be more valuable in the next 10 years than any of my policy reports. And if you look at and I was joking aside, you look at the visceral reaction of social media to the killing of that healthcare executive in the US, and the sense in which the structural violence of an unequal society that is telling person after person that... I had a friend doing a restructure in Oxfam, America, and in America, some of you may be from the US, your healthcare is entirely linked to your job. If you lose your job, you lose your healthcare. Okay, so this poor woman, she was the receptionist at Oxfam America. She was going through cancer treatment, and there was absolutely no way she would have got any other insurance. So my friend, who's a standard manager, who was on secondment from Spain actually, he was doing a restructure. They had 3 receptionists. They wanted to go round to 2. If he'd sacked this woman, she would have died. You know, that's the structural violence of an incredibly unequal society. So I don't think there's anything that says that it has to be a war, it has to be... And I do think we have lots of examples of countries that have managed to grow quite rapidly and reduce their Gini at the same time. We saw some very peaceful reductions in the Gini coefficient in Latin America in the early 2000s. So I'm just saying that the terms of the debate and the terms of the struggle are not being set by the peaceful incrementalists at the moment. That's what I'd say. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, just to say on that, I do think we're in a horrible time. I just think people are like really struggling, and I hear it all the time. Like, we may be relatively wealthy in this room, but it's actually just hard to have very much in this society, and people feel constantly like they're at the bottom of that, they've lost, that they're a loser in society because of the way Instagram is and the way you think that you've got to a certain age and you should have a house, and I've got a 1-year-old, my childcare bill is £1,400 pounds a month, your mortgage or your rent bills are going up, you're like all the bills are going up. Like, I'm in a good job, but if you're not even working class, even lower middle class, things feel really hard. And I think that we underestimate the extent to which people, not just in this country but all around the world, feel on edge. Like, there's just not much more to give. So I think we are in a really horrible time, and I think the failure of the so-called left or centre-left to kind of really deal with that problem is driving people to the right. But actually, you could use that to make an argument for wealth tax. Wealth taxes are more popular now. Like, if you look at various different polling around the world, it's got more. If you ask people more and more, they will say, yeah, the wealthy have got too much. It's not fair. And so people have noticed is that there's not been a kind of political reaction to that everywhere. Some places there has been. I think on the variables, I think maybe Singapore is like an interesting case where they put a lot of money into public infrastructure and people have secure housing, so they can kind of, but I think in general those examples are kind of few and far between, and there's just more and more growing grievances in so many societies, even where, inequality's been sort of high but sort of stable democratically. So the question about sort of gender, migrants, race. I think the problem I have sometimes with this is that one of the countries that we were working with was Canada, and Canada really didn't like us emphasising inequality. So you'll see that we had to put in exclusion because they're really interested in like gender-based inequality, race-based inequality, but they didn't want to talk about capitalism. Oh. So and so this is it's always really important to talk about these things at the same time, because I worry sometimes if you talk about gender inequality without thinking about income and wealth inequality, you just end up saying we just need more women running big, being CEOs of FTSE 100 companies. So I think it's really important to do both. When you do both, you systematically find that, of course, minoritized groups, whether groups that have faced historic discrimination are always at the bottom of the income and wealth structure, and we did work on this in New York as well, like whether it's if you indigenous groups in South America or African Americans in the US, like they're just again and again you find that with women you see disparities, especially in terms of pay. So for me it's really important to do both at the same time and not lose the income and wealth part of that. I know there was another question but I've forgotten.
Okay, let's go to another round. John, and then the young man here, and then you. John?
Thanks for these talks. I think very provocative. I have
I guess two points maybe with the question. One, I think it's important to account for the fact that the distasteful politics is not just happening in one country, it's happening in a lot of places.
Yeah.
I think it's important to, why are people voluntarily voting for this in different countries? Why is nativistic, nationalist, right-wing populism winning election? People aren't, no one puts a gun to anyone's head to vote for Donald Trump, as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm the second thing is, why are these countries that are the most unequal, like the United States, have more immigrant application requests than the rest of the world combined? Why do people still want to go to these very unsavory places? Are they brainwashed, or, I think it's important to answer that. Third, by the way, in mainstream economics, the median voter theory would suggest that in elections, the more unequal the society, the more kind of left-center coalition should win elections. The opposite's happening, so that's an interesting thing to take account of and explain related to the previous things. Two other quick points. I mean, there's a book by Eric Scheidel, which is not just about post-World War II, called The Great Leveler. I mean, it's a quite careful historical point that the inequality is the natural set if you go back 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. And then after wars, there were these interregnum periods that are very short-lived of equalizing fiscal policies. And I think that's a kind of important to keep in mind. I do think there's more of a fight than we think. The last point I'd like to make is that the most pro-poor reform we've had in history has been large-scale agrarian reform, accompanied by a production strategy. And that has never taken place in an electoral democracy. It's taken place in places like Taiwan, South Korea, Eastern Europe, Bolshevik Revolution, China, Castro's Cuba. I think that's related to my first point. I think that's important to explain that elites don't seem to be giving up their privileges in democratic contexts very often. As a matter of fact, we don't have a case of that in history. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we think about what's feasible.
I'm Johan Choi, studying environment and development in LSE. And I have two questions regarding corporate philanthropy. So, like, to deal with inequality, like, the resource mobilization is important. And also, regarding, considering the funding size, the funding from government is important, but also the funding from corporate is important because, let's just Fianza showed us through the presentation, there's a lot of billionaires. Like, we can see that. So, like, what do you think about the role of corporate philanthropy, and if it's important, like, how could we nudge more corporate to this funding?
Okay.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you for the talk. I'm Haley from LSE2. That's very unfortunate that I also have the same question about the resource mobilization. I don't know, it's because I like it. It's because we're studying at LSE, I don't know. I'm studying MPA, and at the end of the discussion, we always talk about, so where's the funding? So, especially in the sector of inequality, I don't see many like innovations or like partnership working between like public sector and private sector. So I wonder, like, is there any like good case from the work? And yeah, I think that's my question.
Okay, so let's do this round. Faiza?
On the private sector, I mean, there's different philanthropists and what have you, but in general, what I found is that because this is about structural change, that this is about redistributing wealth, this is hopefully about, underlying issues like land reform that would actually make a difference, that it's not in the interest of a lot of those private sector big corporations to support that kind of thing. So they're happy to do something on gender inequality that's like not about capitalism, if you know what I mean. But, you know, they're not happy to give funding on a project that's going to look at how we fundamentally shift not just income and wealth distribution, but also with it power, because they understand that they have a lot of power right now. So I hate to be a bit cynical about it, but in general, I don't know, Ha-Joon, maybe you've had something.
Can I add kind of quantitative footnote to this?
Yeah.
The US has the most developed philanthropic sector. And the last time I looked, this is probably 7-8 years ago, so it might have changed a bit. It accounted for 1.7% of GDP. The average size of welfare state in the OECD is 21.6% of GDP. So unless you jack this up by 10 times, it's not even close. So you have to realize that. I mean, never mind the kind of things that you could do, but sometimes people have the excessive expectation about philanthropy. It's still very, very small. So.
It's also, I think it's undemocratic. I mean, it's undemocratic.
Yeah.
I mean, why should Gates decide, where the money for the health should go in a country? And I remember sitting, when I was at Save the Children, sitting next to the health team, and them getting really angry with the Gates Foundation because they wanted them to invest in health centres rather than on specific diseases that would make Gates feel like I ended, malaria.
Right.
And he didn't. And then what happened? Ebola happened. And those health centres weren't there and it wasn't set up. And so, I'm very wary of this kind of individual, I've got a lot of money, I'm going to solve this problem. I just, I don't buy it at all. On kind of why it's happening everywhere, I think this is a really fundamental question. I think it's the strength of the right. It's the fact that often media is also, in whatever country you look at, is often owned by particular billionaires. Like they often say that the right does politics on easy because they don't have the same pushback that the left has. But also, honestly, having been part of the left and worked politically, the left is just not good enough. I mean, look what just happened. I mean, the US is a good example. Like, they don't offer an alternative enough of the time that people will vote for it. And my experience is that when you do have something else, that people will vote for it, and you will get support. But you've got to, actually sort it out, and you can't be nice about it. So that's. That, and then I think there was a point about kind of policies better that someone asked, like that policies, not all policies are equal. It's what should the focus be? And I absolutely agree with someone that was saying about kind of land reform and those big things. I mean, certainly for Pakistan, that's a big problem as to why. I mean, it's, in some ways, it's still a feudal system because people live on the land owned by someone who also runs for parliament, and they all have to vote for them. I mean, it's still the case. It's really upsetting. But yeah, I think there are some big key things that you could do on, certainly, the thing is now with wealth taxes, I always used to argue when I first started working on inequality that we shouldn't just focus on taxes because, that's when the problem has got really bad. We should do all these things, what they call pre-distribution, look more at education and, unionisation, all the rest of it, so that we deal with the problem before it gets that bad. But now wealth inequality is so extreme that we need a corrective to that. So certainly we do need to be making the arguments and having the fight on wealth inequality and wealth taxes. Max?
Yeah, I would. I think that the biggest single thing that's happened in our lifetimes is this incredible transfer of wealth from the public space to the private. So you have a situation where the world is richer than it's ever been before. There's an immense amount of wealth in the world, but it's increasingly held in private hands. So, and then obviously the natural thing is to then think some of those private hands could give more money, and philanthropy is a natural reaction. And conflict of interest, my wife works for the Gates Foundation, and we do debate this quite often at the dinner table. But Bill Gates himself says that the first duty of a billionaire is to pay their taxes, and he supports a 50% tax rate on billionaires, because even he sees the massive limits to philanthropy, not least that he struggles to get the majority of billionaires to do it. I mean, they're quite happy to just sit on their money. So I think it is limited and tax is the answer. I just wanted to come back on the point about building on the point about the left. There's a fabulous philosopher in the US called Michael Sandel. You should read his books if you haven't read them before. And he has some wonderful theories about this. And one of them is that because the left really believes in the kind of hyper-individualism of you can make it if you try, the classic would be the American dream. If you look at all Obama's speeches, it's always about let's equalise opportunities so anyone can be rich if they work hard. And the problem with that is that for every winner, there are lots of other people who don't win. And it sounds very positive, but something that Donald Trump and I think the right across the world have cottoned onto is that people want collective solutions to their problems. They don't want hyper-individualism. And the collectiveness they're offering them is racism, it's Germany against the world, it's make America great again. But he goes through all the speeches of Donald Trump. Donald Trump never talks about the American dream. He never talks about working hard and getting it. It's about making America great again. Everybody can be great again. And by that, of course, he only means white Americans. But, the point is there's a collectiveness on the right that the left just ignores consistently. And that's why we keep losing. If we had, because our collective solutions, as the median voter theory shows, ultimately, poor people are going to vote for policies rationally that benefit them. They're not going to vote for tax cuts for billionaires. So you have to mount an enormous exercise of lying and subterfuge and misinformation to convince working class people that Elon Musk knows what's best for them. So I agree with Faiza. The failure is on the left entirely, and they're obsessed. They just don't believe it anymore. Like Keir Starmer, if he wanted to right now, could be using the shock of Donald Trump to say, I need to increase defence spending. Income taxes always go up during wars because rich people can't complain. So he could say, okay, so we're going to introduce emergency temporary taxes on wealth to fund an increase in defence. Solidarity taxes, and all of the rich people have to keep quiet because it's a national emergency. But instead, he decides to slash the aid budget and hurt the poorest people. As long as those people are standing up and saying they're left-wing politicians, we do.
In a way, this is a consequence of the third way, isn't it? Because that's the left essentially abandoning collectivism and buying into the individualistic discourse. Anyway, let's do another. You've been patiently waiting, so you and the lady here and the man there. So the one in the third row.
Thank you. I just wanted to first point out that the previous question on the evolution of definition of inequality wasn't answered. And also, so my question is, it relates back to the point that Dr. T. made. In the political economy of development module, the point that's repetitively emphasized is that you need to make the elites care for the development to really take off. And obviously it's so challenging to make them care about these progressive policies such as wealth taxes because there simply is no incentive for that. And I think you mentioned letting the people mix in these public spaces to expose them to other lived realities was one of the solutions. But what other ways are there to really make the elites care about this mandate of inequality? Thank you.
I have two questions. One, I want to specifically ask about the gender ideology that becoming a consolidated force in growing efficiency. If you could elaborate more on that, and how can we strategize without leaning into class-setting approach? And then the second, how can we locate human rights mechanism and its system in addressing this inequality? Has it addressed it, or it's become an enabler to the inequality itself?
I'm an economics student at LSE, and I have two questions. Firstly, about I wanted to ask about the global north and global south divide and how we can bridge that apart from imposing wealth taxes. So what can we do to address the international inequalities that exist? And secondly, I wanted to ask that if we impose wealth taxes, I assume that it will require a lot of international collaboration cooperation, because they might have an incentive to buy a citizenship somewhere else in the UK. So I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, good. So another round. Want to start, Max?
Yeah, I'll just be really quick. Starting at the end, I do think that it's surprising in our research just how much countries can do on tax without international cooperation, and developing countries too. So Colombia, for instance, has a reasonably successful wealth tax and has had for quite a long time. So does Morocco. Many countries don't even have the basic things like a property tax or an inheritance tax. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit on taxing the rich that doesn't involve a big global agreement. But that said, there is a limit to how far you can go without more coordination, and rich people are incredibly mobile with their money. So, but whenever you read in the newspaper, all the rich people are all going to run away, I always remember in the financial crisis. In fact, there's been some wonderful work done at LSE just recently about this, interviewing rich people and saying, are you going to leave? And will you go and live in Geneva? And they'll say, Geneva is so boring. I'm not going to go to the opera, I'll miss all my friends, So,
and also the private
they have opera house.
The schools are not nearly as good, So that rich people are a lot less mobile than you think. I think I just wanted to answer on that one,
It's a really hard question on making elites care. I mean, I guess for me, you could put a lot of energy into that. And sometimes we have to in these jobs, quite honestly, to get funding, for instance. I think they care. Some of them that are more open-minded are caring now because, they are at least liberal in their values. I was on Newsnight the other night with a Tory, I won't say who it was, but someone that really messed up the economy. An ex-Tory chancellor, and he was saying, I'm giving it away. He was like, it's terrible. These people, they don't like multiculturalism like us. And I was like, what? How are we in the same? This is mad. But some of those people are like, oh no, suddenly things are going too far. And so, maybe some of them will make up. But what I would say is that it's really important that we invest more of our energies on getting the public more mobilized and building and solidarity in action across the broader spectrum. Gender, I was just going to say on gender, the story, Ha-Joon can probably talk about it more. I was really struck in terms of what happened in South Korea and, a pretty homogenous population in terms of race, but then they were able to say, these girls now, women's equality has gone too far, and it's something that is reverberated around the right. And by the way, the right have a playbook. They share all these tactics. They absolutely do. And so, and they really did a good job. There was just a massive difference. Was it 20-point difference or something between the way young men voted and young women voted in that election? Because the young men thought the reason I'm struggling to find a good job and housing, etc., is because of these girls. And it's a classic, isn't it? Yeah. And so, and it's interesting how misogyny is really taken hold, Andrew Tate and the rest of it. It's really, really a problem. And honestly, I'm not the expert on this, and I struggle to tell you. Obviously you need to do the material change so that, that they don't have that argument, that you have that this is how you're going to get good jobs and how you get that balance right, because I'm seeing some people going too far the other way and say, just, you women need to be quiet now, and we just need to, focus on masculinity and I was on the TV the other day, I had a debate whether we should teach wrestling to boys, and, it just genuinely, this is just getting ridiculous. So, I don't have the answer for that, but it's a very core problem. And even, I, as someone that was previously an economist, I think way more about these issues now because they are true blockers to change. Human rights, I'm not an expert on that, but I do sometimes, in the UK, it just doesn't have a lot of credence and in some other countries too. I just think that sometimes some people use it to sidestep, again, issues of capitalism and the way the economy is working. And then quickly and just more positively on, I guess, global inequality and what needs to change. When I was in New York, I got to observe a lot of what was happening at the UN. And so many countries low and middle income countries are so angry. They're angry because of debt. They're so angry because of the way in which vaccines were hoarded by the West. I mean, like my family in Pakistan got their vaccines from China. And they were extremely angry, even then, probably even more angry now, about the double standards by which Russia invading Ukraine was being treated versus how the US and UK and others had invaded Iraq, what was happening with Palestine. There is so much anger at that level. And one thing, I'm not saying it's going to be a better New World Order, but often I go on, again, I do quite a lot of media, and they'll be like, oh no, it's the end of the world order because Trump's not with Europe. I'm like, do you know, for most of the world, this world order has not been working at all.
That's right.
And so what is going to come now, and I don't think that China's perfect, I don't think that, but there is a different conversation happening now, and there's lots of problems with the UN, but I do think there are new blocs forming, countries are looking regionally what they can do to stand up, and I think there could be some promise and positivity there with an end of this very unequalizing global world order.
Wow, on that very positive note, which is very rare to hear when you talk about inequality. Let's stop there so that we don't get depressed more. Okay, thank you, Faiza. Thank you, Max.